Hope you all have good days, and welcome to watching. And for people in back, thanks for listening and my sound to commentary or however, I really do appreciate it. This whole thing has been a lot, and honestly, I really appreciate Jessie Gender's videos on like commentary across the board, and I wanted to across the history of watching Dave Chappelle's things, but it's not just about Dave Chappelle, it's more about how our society is about these things and how we can perpetuate a really big, and I wanted to talk about it. And I'm gonna go a couple of things before, but I just wanted to have something to say and I'll play some music for us to listen to while I wait for people. And I know that I'm live right now. Thank you for waiting for this. This is Thrown in a Loop from my third album called Music Fucked. It's also musically, lyrically, gender fucked. There's a bunch of different stuff. I really like what I did. Let me know if this is a good volume with me. Okay, I gotcha, and thanks for coming by. Sometimes I like the choppy because it's really glitchy, Remember, if you'd like. And hope you have a good day. And I hope you feel better. So, yeah. I'm just letting people know about this. Big hearts. I really like that brand that I have. It's a nice purple, indigo blue is a nice colour. This is Underdog. This is Underdog. Makes sense. I appreciate you. I'm gonna put captions on when I share the video, so that we should be able to read it. Captions off. I make things so much easier. So the next song I'm thinking that would be a chill time song. I really like that one. This is Glitch Hop Industrial. It's the first MIDI, composition I fully made across the board. Made a music video for it too. What? No, I'm gonna start actually sharing the video, okay? Alright. Here we go.
He was attacked on stage by someone from the crowd.
Here we go. For the load.
Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. Unfortunately, this video, I kind of want to talk about a recent incident involving Dave Chappelle, namely the incident where he was attacked on stage by someone from the crowd during his Hollywood Bowl comedy set in Los Angeles. Now initially I didn't plan on talking about this incident, all considering that it doesn't really touch upon what I normally talk about on this channel, namely LGBTQ and transgender issues, and the only sort of direct link to any of those discussions have to do Dave Chappelle himself, who is a comedian who was fairly controversial these past few months, considering some of the things that he discussed in his recent Netflix special surrounding transgender people. Namely that a lot of transgender people, myself included, be harmful and hurtful, leading to a big pushback from the transgender community, as well as employees of Netflix itself surrounding it, leading to a protest of Netflix employees outside of the company against Dave Chappelle himself, and then many people on the right, Dave Chappelle himself, also stating that they saw this as evidence of cancel culture, trying to silence somebody, just trying to talk about transgender people, and trans people just getting upset because we can't take jokes, and it's just another version of the woke mob coming for Chappelle or comedian person that's being discussed because we talked about trans people. Now, obviously, there's a lot more context about that, and I'll get into it a little bit more specifically down the line in this video. But other than that link to Japan, there really didn't seem to be anything to discuss with this incident surrounding the stuff that I normally talk about, especially considering the person that tried to attack Chappelle was a cisgender man to do with the transgender community at all. However, as days have gone by since the incident, I've seen a very troubling and concerning trend surrounding how this incident has been discussed, specifically in regards to trans people. Because despite the fact that, again, we had nothing to do with this, some of the things that Chappelle said immediately after the incident, namely that he joked that the man was a trans man, we'll talk about that in a second. I think I'll have some things to say that people will be surprised that I will actually be forgiving of Chappelle on in that. We'll talk about that. Even more concerningly, how this incident has been taken and is that are typically very discussing trans issues in a trans, and how that has led to, I have seen harassment of not only myself, just as a trans person in an online space and someone who spoke about Chappelle months ago, having nothing to do with this incident, also just trans people in general, and how I think that it's concerning considering not only what it says about this incident and how we discuss surrounding people like Dave Chappelle, who are community, but also the larger way that trans people are viewed,
dang it.
seen
I forgot to share it.
Discourse in society today, and how that continually leads to increasing violence and harassment.
Sorry about that. I forgot to directly share it. I think. Yeah, I had to do. Whoops. Okay, I got it now. Sorry about that. I'll start it over. Just have it for the consistency. Alright. Here we go. The closed captions are on. Official start. Third time's the charm, I suppose.
Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. Unfortunately, for today's video, I kind of want to talk about an incident involving comedian here, namely the incident where he was attacked on stage by someone from the crowd during his Hollywood Bowl comedy set in Los Angeles. Now, initially I didn't plan on talking about this incident, considering that it doesn't really touch upon any of the issues that I talk about on this channel, namely LGBTQ and transgender issues, and the only sort of direct link to any of those discussions happens to be that this incident happened to Dave Chappelle himself, who is a comedian who was fairly controversial these past few months, considering some of the things that he discussed in his recent Netflix special, the closer surrounding transgender, namely that a lot of transgender people, myself included, found a lot of his words to be harmful and hurtful, leading to a big pushback from the transgender community, as well as a lot of employees of Netflix itself surrounding his words, leading to a protest of Netflix employees outside of the company, as well as a larger backlash against Dave Chappelle himself, and then many people on the right and Dave Chappelle himself also stating that they saw this as evidence of cancel culture, trying to silence somebody for free speech who was just trying to talk about transgender people, and transgender people just because we can't take jokes and it's just another version of the woke Chappelle or whatever comedian person that's being dismissed because we talked about trans people. Now,
let's see, better quality.
Trans people. More context about that, and I'll get into it a little bit more specifically down the line in this video. But other than that link to the topic at hand, there really didn't seem to be anything to discuss with this surrounding the stuff that I normally talk about, especially the person that tried to attack Chappelle was a cisgender man, having nothing to do with the transgender community at all. However, as days have gone by since the I've seen a very troubling and concerning trend surrounding how this incident has been discussed, specifically in regards to trans people, because despite the fact that again we had nothing to do with it immediately after the incident, namely that he joked. Talk about that in a second. I think they'll have some things to say that people will be surprised that I will actually Chappelle on, and that we'll talk about that in a minute. But even more has been taken and reported on, even by places that are typically very good at discussing trans issues in a trans context, and how that has led to, I have seen, harassment of not only myself, just as a trans person in an online space and someone who spoke about
Not like okay.
Chappelle months ago, having nothing to do with this incident, but also just trans people.
Oh no. Maybe it'll work out. Sorry about the glitches, I'm still getting used to streaming on a computer, but I'll just use this as a commentation point.
In general, and how I think that it's concerning, considering not only what it says about this incident and how we discuss trans people surrounding people like Dave Chappelle, who are controversial within the trans community, but also the larger way that trans people are viewed and seen in discourse in society today, and how that continually leads to further and increased violence and harassment against transgender people, both online and in physical public spaces. And so I want to talk about all of that because I do find it concerning. But before I get into a sort of reiteration of the incident that happened, I want to say first, and this is the most important thing to say about this incident, is that I am earnestly and honestly incredibly glad he's doing seemingly well after the incident, that he seems to be perfectly physically fine. I hope that he is mentally okay. I know that this is very scary for anybody, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they've said in the past. I know this can be a very scary somebody, and so I just wish Chappelle, and I am very glad that he is okay, and I think that that's the most important thing to really. And so I
Pause it here.
just wanted to make sure that that was clear, because while I am going to be talking about this,
So that's just the beginning 3 minutes, but you know, there is a way about it all. I think people really need to be mindful, because things as a joke, however, understand the full implications of what's being said or the impact of what's being done. But yeah, it's like, I'm not gonna justify wrong in any case, you know. It's something else when people justify and brush off how awful violence really is in any capacity, in my opinion.
In a transgender context, I want to make sure that people know that I don't think that the transgender connection thing here, and me discussing this within a transgender context is not me trying to make it all about trans. Some people are going to take it that way. Me just talking about something that happened regarding this incident may have a certain perspective on to override a larger concern about Dave Chappelle's safety. So just wanted to make sure that that is right up front, because it's always making it about transgender people. I want to make it very clear. Glad he's safe. So with that being said, let's talk about what happened. Dave Chappelle was performing a comedy set at the Hollywood Bowl, which was part of a set of numerous different comedian people, like Jon Stewart was there, I believe Chris Rock was there, several major comedians were at this. It wasn't just a Dave Chappelle specific show. But during his set, a man named Isaiah Lee stepped onto the stage and ran and tackled Dave Chappelle, and as we later learned, he did have a dagger on his body that looked like a fake handgun, but then after attacking Dave Chappelle, security sort of tried to come at him and he ran on, and Dave Chappelle got up and realized my thoughts about gender issues, like, it's pretty badass to like get tackled and then try to keep going on with the show. So why is Dave Chappelle continued with the set and the show kept going? And it also should be praised and noted too that Chappelle called after the incident and that he wanted it to be a, quote, peaceful moment. However, there were a few key things that happened beyond that. First and foremost, before the man came up on stage to attack Chappelle, Dave Chappelle made a joke pretty much almost immediately right before it happened that he had been feeling unsafe given that the gender people who were harassing him online and even sending him death threats because of his words about transgender people in the Closer special that I did. And then once Isaiah Lee had been chased off and was being arrested and grabbed by Dave Chappelle himself made a joke that said, oh, it was a trans man that attacked him, leading to the crowd to laugh at that joke.
Thank you, son. It was a trans man.
So that's the basic broad strokes of the incident. We'll talk a little bit more about Isaiah Lee specifically in just a little bit, but that's basic, and a lot of different conversations have sort of jumped off because of this. Some around security at the Hollywood Bowl, some around how many comedians feel like, considering after the incident with Will Smith and Chris Rock at the Oscars, people will feel like they can go up and attack comedians on stage and make that more socially acceptable, which is a whole other conversation that I'm not really going to touch upon here, but it is one that has stemmed out from this. As well as for the potential violent treatment of Lee during his arrest. The leading ones that I saw in my personal circles as a trans person was surrounding the fact that Dave Chappelle had made that joke about it being a trans man immediately after him being attacked. Despite we later learned, the man who attacked him was not trans at all. And a lot of people for that joke immediately after the incident, because they saw it as, in their words, a cheap shot at transgender, vilifying us for something that I've even seen people in certain Twitter spaces to go so far as to say this is evidence that Dave Chappelle actively hates and despises transgender people. And while I wouldn't necessarily go that far, I do understand the kernel of the criticism. But I do feel like a lot of Dave Chappelle's words are kind of forgetting the context in which they were said. But this is not to forgive him for this, because I do have major issues with that joke. But I do think people forget that he was literally just attacked on stage. And the joke about it being a trans man that attacked him came off of the fact that just a few minutes earlier, he had said that he had felt unsafe around the transgender community. So there was like a direct nowhere that was like, it was a trans man, despite having and not having said anything about the transgender community. There was a sort of context that joke was within, given that he had just been attacked. And also, like, I think it's a little bit harsh to thinking through every single thing perfectly after literally just been tackled to the ground by a man with a deadly weapon. And so I think that criticism targeted directly at the joke as having some sort of direct malicious intent right after the fact, I think is a misunderstanding of what exactly happened and probably what Chappelle was. However, what I do find to be more, and honestly more concerning to me, is the fact that that was the joke that he reached for as sort of an instinctive one right after that incident, after having been harmed and attacked. And also the fact that even before the incident, he was talking about feeling unsafe because of the transgender community. I think those two things in conjunction, the subconsciousness of it and the fact that he was about it beforehand, are actually more to me than actually someone thinking that Dave Chappelle had malicious intent in trying to directly vilify the transgender community right after this incident. And it gets to the heart of really what I want to talk about here. Because after the closure came out, a lot of the prevailing discussions around how people saw the transgender community reacting to the special, Dave Chappelle was being canceled by the trans community about the trans community. And that we were just trying to cancel him and we were a woke mob coming after him. It sort of painted the trans community as overly sensitive, aggressive, angry, vitriolic, and hateful.
So his speech, violence, their violence is speech. See how that works?
And this is something that Dave Chappelle himself played into with him saying after the fact that he felt like trans people were just yelling at him and not actually listening to him and wanting to have a conversation.
To the community, I am more than willing to give you an audience, but you will not summon me. I am not bending to anybody's demands.
However, if you actually listen to what a lot of the most saying, myself included in video, we're saying is trying to have a nuanced discussion about what Dave Chappelle was talking about in his. As our basic criticisms, and this is something that I said in my video, again, I'm on record with this, but a lot of other prominent transgender people were saying this. Employees at Netflix or quit Netflix or talked about Dave Chappelle after the incident were saying we didn't want Dave Chappelle canceled. But what we were trying to get at is a lot of his jokes that he was making weren't really jokes. And he may have seen them as jokes. But a lot of what they were things that transgender people hear every day as harassment against us.
The best way that I can describe what I'm saying this without doing a whole video on it is to just say that a lot of his jokes may have seemed novel and new to a stranger audience who didn't know much about the community, but the things that he was saying as jokes were things often used to say to harass and attack trans people in public and online spaces. It's not new or novel to us, and you hear it when we are being harassed. To make a kind of comparison to help illuminate what I'm trying to say, it's kind of like if, to a degree, a white comedian went up on stage and just started to say jokes that we now know as racism, but just in a funny way, and white people in the audience laughing at that because they didn't understand how those statements work towards black people to attack and harass them, because they didn't have an understanding of black people's experiences, which is we've seen in onstage comedy history. This isn't trans and racial issues are the same or of the same level, but just using that as an example to describe the dynamic and the criticism being leveled at Chappelle.
On top of that, one of the things he talked about in the special is that he was team side with people like J.K. Rowling, who have spoken out against transgender people. And seemingly placing as just people asking questions about women's issues and transgender people, and they just view transgender people as, I think in his words, were blackface for women. And it misses the context that, and I've talked about this in numerous other videos, that many TERFs and gender-critical feminists and other people as well are not just asking questions about the transgender community, or not talking about women's rights in transgender context. TERFs are directly attacking the transgender community, focused directly on the transgender community. I mean, you have things like the LGBT Alliance United Kingdom, which is a gender-critical TERF group, targeting things like Stonewall, advocating against transgender right legislations, Rowling herself being cited in numerous anti-transgender legislations throughout the United States, and things like anti-transgender healthcare bill, as well as a lot of misinformation that many gender-critical feminists try to push surrounding the trans community that have now become more and more mainstream to try and target transgender rights issues. And so a lot of transgender people pushing back against that specific part of his special. That's funny, not because we can't take a joke. Many trans people can take a joke, believe us, we can make fun about transgender people. We're very weird, it's strange, it's cool. But that a lot of his jokes were just harassment, and that he gave credence to a targetedly and directly attack the transgender community. And if you leave me on that or don't understand the context of that, I made this video as well that goes into that. But then on top of that though, and I said this again in video, and I know many other transgender
people said this as well, that he did points to make in his initial special. That he did have a point to make about how many LGBTQ people, white LGBTQ people specifically, could still enact racist actions like calling the police on a black man during an incident. It was actually a salient point about how there's an intersection between many white LGBT people being able to ignore the of people of color, black specifically, because we are still white and we still have privilege even if we are LGBTQ, and also face marginalization for that.
Do you think I hate?
Yeah, like, honestly, it is a whole thing with how people don't realize how intersections work or how people can be marginalized in various ways or capacities. People keep looking at one faction and thinking they're only one certain type, and it's erasure. It's serious erasure that I think we all really need to be more mindful of and acknowledge, and at least really pay attention to the facts of the matter. Because even with someone thinking something's a joke or they don't fully understand it or they are ignorant, it still perpetuates an impact on our society, whatever we do. We all have a footprint in this world, and that's why I think we really need to be mindful of that. And just because someone calls themselves a comedian, or just because someone calls something funny because it's violence and they find violence funny, I just think I'm not someone who'd brush that off.
Hate gay people, and what you're really seeing is that I am jealous of gay people. Oh, I'm jealous. I'm not the only black person that's this way. We blacks, we look at the gay community and we go, damn, and look how well that movement is.
And again, there's also more criticism within that as him just painting the LGBTQ and transgender community as all one thing without recognizing that as gender critical feminists themselves, who sometimes identify as lesbians, not all of them are lesbians, and not all lesbians are gender critical feminists. Don't want to make sure I make that clear. But also missing that there's community, as well as the fact that not every LGBTQ person is white, and that the most marginalized people, that we see, especially within the transgender community, but just in society writ large, are black transgender women and other transgender women of color. And even the protest from employees of Netflix surrounding the special, if you looked at their actual demands surrounding the special, it wasn't that Dave Chappelle should, shut up, never Chappelle, he sucks. A lot of the demands were asking to have more inclusive policies within Netflix, like hiring more transgender people, maybe trying to have more LGBTQ representatives, having more specialists from transgender comedians, like transgender people a platform as well, so that the most predominant conversations about us aren't from a man who isn't the transgender community, but that actually we get to be in the room both behind the scenes and in front of the camera surrounding discussions of our own issues. The largest conversation. So while there was this painting of the transgender community as a woke mob, listen to what transgender people have to say, critique. And we didn't actually want Dave Chappelle to be silent, but that we did think, but we also had larger concerns about the way that he discussed and framed transgender people. However, all of that got it as cancel culture. And this is something that I've talked about numerous times, but it's something we see a lot within cancel culture narrative, that it flattens all criticism of somebody as just the most vitriolical and over the top. That even gender people who are trying to be critical, kind, caring, open, as trying to be, you'll tell me if I was or not, but out and sending death threats against Dave Chappelle. That we're all sort of transgender people are sending death threats to Dave Chappelle. And we see this numerous times with any sort of painting of the marginalized community. We see it with just black people in general, see it with the LGBTQ community in general, and we even see this directly again with transgender people, with like people like J.K. Rowling will like point to very over-the-top death threat, harassment from transgender people or transgender people allies in order to paint all transgender as simply harassing, violent, and vitriolic. And then thereby painting to the mainstream discussion around transgender people as all angry. Now to be clear, this is by no means saying that I don't think that that doesn't happen. I know that there are problems, or J.K. Rowling, but that most transgender people aren't that. That most transgender people, myself included, would condemn that. Not think it is okay to send death threats at all. Criticism at him, yes. Some very targeted, stern criticisms as well, and very much just like, but never harassment and death threats. Like, totally, as well as us asking for him not to be given further platforms, or that he doesn't have a right to say what he wants to say, but that he doesn't deserve a platform like Netflix specials, especially if trans people are also not given one to talk about our own issues when we're talking about trans issues. But that's what cancel culture people against you as the most harmful version of them, so that you feel attacked and hurt, and thereby leading to your audience becoming more and more enamored with you and more protective of you, so that it builds up your niche, your audience. We saw Dave Chappelle doing this quite directly, because very soon after the incident, that he went in front of sold-out crowds of people, because they were sold out to try and defend him from the woke mob, and he used the incident in order to sell tickets to a movie that had nothing to do with transgender people, saying that movie that transgender people didn't want me.
If nobody will touch it, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make it available for all of you in 10 amenities, going on sale in the next few days. You will be able to see this movie in its entirety, and you can see what they're trying to obstruct you from seeing. And you can judge for yourself, but you cannot have this conversation and exclude my voice from it. That is only fair. You have to answer the question, am I canceled or not?
Not to mention the fact that after all the controversy, Netflix gave him 4 more specials, and even a comedy tour, of which the Hollywood Bowl was one, as it was part of the Netflix is a Joke comedy tour. So not only were trans people not heard and our point of view ignored, but Dave Chappelle continued to reach career heights despite his overt support of an anti-transgender hate movement, while trans people were vilified by the media at the same time, using Chappelle's words of cancel culture. And so, did have salient things to say. It ended up feeling like, and I don't know if this was intention, I'm not inside the man's head, but it definitely appeared that he was using this cancel culture wave in order to bolster his pocketbook or bolster his brand, at the expense of throwing transgender
under the bus. Like, I really, it's a lot, because I get that, the way people talk about cancel culture can vary just depending on what someone's idea of it, idea of holding accountability for their actions, idea of being criticized accordingly or not accordingly, I guess, for things that they have done, whether popular or not. And it's really odd to me how people are like, he's gotten cancelled or whatever. And it's like this dude's a multi-million-dollar guy who's gotten all of these specials, as you can see, and someone who used and said that trans people hated him because they gave him avid criticism for his rhetoric and support of literal gender supremacists, and how he's talked about things before is just as someone who is trans and black. It hurts, especially having someone frame as if trans people can only be white, as if people that like old black people are straight or something, because that's not true. It's never been true, and I'm really sick of the polarizing rhetoric of acting like people can't be held accountable for their actions. And it's like, honestly, seeing people be like, sometimes cancel culture is really a dog whistle because of the fact of how people use it and how they treat it as if being held accountable is them being cancelled and being harassed and awful and pitchforks, when it's like they're the one perpetuating literal societal genocide. Like, people do not give they don't give the matter of our words the weight they deserve, I think. And a lot of people, they'll hear that someone says that they're a comedian or hear someone says they're funny, and then they'll be like, oh, whatever they say is okay, because they go after everybody, or they they do all sorts of stuff that adds or contributes to societal oppression because they want to use marginalization as something to give a laugh at. But the thing is, what we laugh about, what we brush off, has an avid effect on what our society thinks of these things, is the thing I'm trying to really get at here. You get what I'm saying?
Under the bus with not only his discussions around us and the misinformation that he spread around the TERF community, but just the painting of transgender people as hateful, vitriolic, and angry. Not only that, but even within Chappelle talked to transgender comedians that he considered a friend who died by suicide. As Chappelle claims she received a ton of harassment from the transgender community for defending Chappelle for his words on trans people before he had said. However, many people noted, including comedian's roommate, that this necessarily wasn't the case, that this comedian was dealing with a lot, including a lust in public, as partially why she may have died from suicide. So Chappelle talking about her in this way not only felt exploitative, as well as using a "I have a trans best friend" story in order to protect himself from criticism of his special, which we do see people using to defend Chappelle's things like this.
I saw an article. They said his transphobic statements. They're not fucking statements. They're jokes. They're not jokes that are transgender. They're jokes that feature trans people. They're not transphobic jokes. His whole bit special that everybody was mad at is essentially a love letter friend that killed herself because she was supporting him and she got attacked on stage.
While also at the same time, that story to again paint transgender people as all harassers and ridiculous and over the top, leading to someone to die. Again, not to say any harassment was okay or right, but that most transgender people would condemn it and that it was wrong categorically and not something specific to the transgender community, but something we see in all online spaces today. Which then leads us back to this incident at the Hollywood Bowl. Because before the attack happened, he said that he felt like he was in danger from the transgender community, that he felt like he needed security from the transgender community. Which, by saying that, it not only paints the transgender community as harassing and hurtful and vitriolic, but actively violent. All of us, not just specific ones, but the entire trans community, is somehow ready and willing to violently assault Dave Chappelle. Any reasonable person, which is most transgender people, would not want. Again, this isn't to say that there aren't people who have been sending death threats to him, who would not wish harm on him. But to say that only transgender people are like that, I think is missing how this happens no matter what's the case. That you could literally point anywhere because of the way that our online discourse has become so and over the top and vitriolic to any point. Literally everyone gets death threats all the time. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. So to say that it's somehow unique to the trans community, that you feel like the trans community is going to come after you because of us being specifically trans, what this does in turn then is justify saying that we should go out and attack transgender people because they're trying to attack us. Now, I'm not saying that Dave Chappelle himself is saying that we should go and attack transgender people, but what we have seen increasingly more and more and more and more lately is a lot of public figures, such as literal Congress people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, as well as some other Congress people, saying that we should attack and harm transgender people, that justified to attack transgender people because of them being violent or angry. And this also dovetails, by the way, with a lot of discussions that we're seeing elsewhere surrounding how the LGBTQ community in general is being painted as idolizing children, as groomers, as trying to harm the children. We see this with things like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida or the anti-trans healthcare laws in Texas, that these are laws around protecting the children from the grooming LGBT people, instead of discussing them as the actual harmful bills that they are to discussions around LGBTQ topics, as well as hurting transgender people's health care. It heightens the discussions around them to the point where if you're just protecting the children with these laws and LGBTQ people and transgender people and the left wants to harm your children because of it, it thereby justifies violence against transgender people. Not just harassment, but actual violence. And because of this more and more hyperbolicized language around the LGBTQ and transgender communities, that we're seeing increasing hate crimes targeted directly at LGBTQ people in general, but specifically trans people. There has been studies showing that hate crimes against trans people are continuing to rise. We've seen this anecdotally and scientifically. I myself, I live in Seattle, which is a fairly I just a few weeks ago was at the supermarket, and a woman started harassing me. I'm a trans person in a space. It was just a trans person in a space, but she felt comfortable saying that to me. I was trans, and this is all directly linked to the fact that we're seeing this diabolization around the transgender community as painting us all as violent harassers. And so going back to Chappelle, what I'm not saying is that I don't think Dave Chappelle shouldn't be open and honest about the fact because of things that he has gotten in terms of death threats, harassment, because of the things that he said around transgender people, thereby leading to him being targeted. Like, he should not receive that at all. I condemn that 150%, and he has every right to share that. But what it does do, because of the lack of nuance around saying the difference between the fringe people that are saying that and just the trans community writ large, the flattening that, it paints all transgender people as these over-the-top, not nuanced, not trying to have real criticisms of him and the harm that some of his words have normalized in our world today, but paints us as being justified being violent against. And he says something like that, and then someone attacks him, and then he makes a joke about it being a trans man. Again, I understand what he made, but the fact that it was immediately reached for. What we saw immediately happening after the incident is that a lot of trans people got harassment because of this incident. This man who, by the way, if you look online, actually is a Trump supporter. He did a whole rap song on harm Dave Chappelle won, and then it did another literally called Trump his president. So the fact that we had nothing to do with the incident directly, and the fact that the man who attacked Dave Chappelle literally has nothing to do with the transgender community, we saw a lot of people going online after the incident to, number one, transgender people were the people that caused so many people in so many comment sections saying that. But not only that, then going on to harass transgender people of this incident. I myself got new comments on my old Dave Chappelle video from months ago, because it was a Dave Chappelle related video and he was sort of regretting because of the event that happened. And those new people were sending harassment to me because I had talked about Dave Chappelle, because I was a public-facing transgender person who had mentioned Chappelle, hopefully with nuance and not vitriol. But I got people saying to me, like, 41% yourself, which % yourself is a reference to the fact that there was one study that said that 41% of transgender people attempt suicide. So saying 41% yourself is saying go kill yourself. That's the harassment that I got. Not for anything that we said, but for just being trans people publicly, after an incident that we had nothing to do with, because of the way that transgender people have been continually painted as violent, harassing, and vitriolic, and deserving. And that got even further complicated, by the way, by the fact that a lot of the reporting initially after the incident, even they have generally been okay about discussing trans issues. Like, for example, BuzzFeed I saw did a whole said Dave Chappelle was attacked. And then the second line after that was Dave Chappelle attacked right after he said that he felt unsafe about transgender community. The headline said nothing about the actual person that attacked Dave Chappelle, nothing about who, or that fact he was a cis man, had nothing to do with the transgender community. The second line literally was that because of the transgender community. And so you see this direct causal link being made in the implication there. Regardless or not, the implication hangs over the air that this was because of the transgender community, despite the fact that we had nothing to do with it. And even, by the way, even if this had been a transgender person who had come up Dave Chappelle on stage, even if it had been the case, still would not mean the entire transgender community is justified being attacked, nor that we don't have honest and earnest and good critiques of what Dave Chappelle has said, nor the fact that I believe if that had happened, most trans included would still have condemned this trans person for having done that. But I would have said if a transgender person attacked him, should face charges. But all of this is sort of the intention of many of these people, right? Not even talking about Dave Chappelle specifically, though I do feel like he's used this cancel culture narrative in order to further his own pocketbook to a degree. But even if we ignore Dave Chappelle, it is in a lot of many media outlets vested in more ones that are more anti-transgender, like places like Fox News and Breitbart and things like that, to paint transgender people with this flat brush of all being violent harassment. Because by doing so, they can use more and more headlines that vilify transgender people in order to push legislation, further these cultural war narratives, using transgender people as the scapegoat in order to, bolster their own power. Voters in say, like, protect yourself from the violent groomer trans people. We'll protect you with the laws that we're pushing, ignoring the fact that actually really help people. Which is evidenced by the fact that we see with Isaiah Lee, and honest a few days later, about the fact that the reason Isaiah Lee attacked him was to try attention to the fact that his mother was facing issues. I'm not sure I necessarily have sympathy for a man who attacked Dave Chappelle, but the point that I sort of want to make, he was a man who felt like he had no recourse to draw attention to his own mother's health issues and plight, other than vitriolically, hatefully, and violently against a man who he saw as a culture war figurehead of that narrative with Dave Chappelle, instead for people who could actually help, and policies that could actually help. Like, he felt so disenfranchised from all of it because he had been so brought into these culture war narratives that people like Trump had pushed, that Isaiah supported, that he felt like it was more useful to him to violently attack making jokes on stage than any that he thought he had available to him, because he probably didn't feel like he did have any other recourse. Again, not giving him overly sympathy, but just sort of like the direct link between these things of how culture war narratives don't help people, leave them franchised but angry, and finding people to lash out against. Okay, thank you so much for indulging me in this conversation. It was a lot, and I actually had a lot more than I thought I wanted to say. I thought this was going to be a video, but I ended up just kind of a lot more than I intended to. But I just saw that this incident with Chappelle, not only to be an interesting one in and of itself, but also found it indicative of a lot of the ways we're transgender people a lot in the media, and how it's more vitriolic and more justifying violence and harassment against transgender people and marginalized people in general. We see similar things with like race theory in education, like we see with the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. It's the same thing being enacted against racial discussion as we're seeing with transgender discussions. I just think it's a confluence of a lot of different things that this situation is indicative of. I wanted to take a moment to talk about. So thank you so much for watching this. I have a few videos coming out this week, a lot of them that I'm very excited about. I'll have a video on Friday. I also have my review of Star Trek Picard Season 2 coming up on Wednesday, so be on the lookout for those. I'm very excited about all of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for all of that. I have a Patreon that you can help support me on. But beyond all of it, live long and prosper. Here we go. I know I've used song once before.
I appreciate how Jessie speaks about these certain topics, because it's really, she looks across all of it and really pays attention to the issues at hand. And I just wanted to really show you that, because I mean, honestly, that was the first time I actually watched it, but I've watched other stuff on Dave Chappelle and Toast, and just how things have been in society is a very consistent creator. And I really want people to be mindful about these things and mindful about what we say and do, because these narratives keep being put into place, and it's disturbing. And it's weird how so many people ignore how much pain they're actually putting into the world because they want to call it a joke. I cannot tell you how many comments I've had of people justify kind of rhetoric and vitriol towards trans people, and that Don't Say Gay bill. Like, a teacher already got fired for talking about kids wanting to be able to express how they felt about paper and an all like project and stuff. And it's really sad because it just teaches people that you'll get fired yourself, basically. You know? And I keep hearing this. I keep seeing this. And I don't think people really pay attention to how insidious it all is. Because, I mean, it's not just Dave Chappelle, but it's like when someone on like big platforms, showing to millions and millions of people, that is definitely going to influence our society. It's definitely influencing what we see in this world, and it's definitely influencing what we consume as well, and what we take in. It's really awful how many articles are made for clickbait. I really hate that so much. And it says a lot when people are performatively active, you know, in the progressive movement, however they say they are a part of it. And it's just been so much, and so many trans people getting harassed after being made out to be after being made out to be the harassers, and we weren't even a part of this, and that's his go-to to say it was a trans man, you know. And people, they keep making these odd digs or something that's not addressing the problem or addressing what needs to be done. And it's a lot of different things. It's not just a simple thing. And it's so tiring. It really is. And I really hate that people have gone after Jessie like that, because Jessie's one of the more thoughtful people I've seen on this platform, or having things to like blatantly and really talk about these issues, being a publicly trans person. And I am too, you know, and I just want things to be better. Like, it's so messed up how much punching down at others is enabled by other marginalized groups of people. Like, it's not fair, it's not right. And, you know, I've said before that, you know, if someone's gonna dig in the knife while people are getting fired and dying and killed and harassed, you know, they are catering to supremacy. And someone said, "Are you calling him a supremacist?" And I'm like, you know, he did say that, but at the same time, it says a lot when people cater to supremacy and double, triple, quadruple, whatever down to profit off of people's pain. And I'm not someone that trusts these elitists at all either. I think people really need to stop playing the polarized game. They need to stop playing the finger pointing tactics of divisiveness. And I just really hate how this keeps happening, how this keeps being enabled, how this keeps existing in our society. And it's like people, they keep going, oh, it's just a joke, oh, it's just whatever. But here's this person literally backing up gender Nazis, you know, people that want people dead, people that want to be eradicated for being different than them, for existing different than them, and wanting to take control of other people's bodily autonomy for things that's not even like hurting anybody. But you know, it really hurts the societal marginalization of people, the 41% of people who are dead now because of how much there is in this world of it, how much hate there is of it. And I really hate it. I hate it so much. It's so absolutely sad. And I was going to play music, but I forgot to put the... Let me see.
An extra video for me this week because I felt
Need to do pause. And I'm gonna make over. Let's see. It's a good song. It's called Dark Harp. It's like the unedited version of In by me. And it's so messed up. I'm going to play the complex transphobia of Dave Chappelle by Jessie Gender next. I think it's very needed for context from like what was before. It's just that, quite recent and going back so we can look at the history of it all, you know what I mean? And also, Jessie has a lot of other analysis stuff, like with film and not just political stuff, and I highly recommend, because it's really cool seeing someone think so in depth about these situations and creations of projects and stuff and how they affect our society in general. However it is, I really appreciate her commentary, and I highly recommend really looking through and checking out content creators that are trans or LGBT or marginalized, and genuinely trying to find content outside of what media tries to push onto you. You know what I mean? I get somebody telling you all about it, but I just think that we all really need to be mindful. I think it help us all out in the end, And it really hurts, seeing people act like this, and being someone who is trans, who's black, who is non-binary, who's honestly disabled. Like, a lot of people want me dead. People like me dead. Wherever I go, someone's gonna hate me, and it's really fucked up, isn't it? I just want things to be better, and I think they really can. Every step we take matters, and everything we do matters way more than what people think. People have to think past, just the initial what they do, I think. Because there's a wave of how we affect people. We affect the people around us, and they affect the people after them, and then our society affects itself. We're an amalgam of personality. 8 billion people's worth, along with other sentients on this earth, And I think people really need to be mindful and really need to educate themselves. And it's really disheartening and sad to see people use the very internet, the very greatest work of Library of Alexandria that we have to date, and use it to spread misinformation and further divide within our society. Because it could be a greater tool, a greater use of it than that, I believe. And then I think we're gonna play Trust. I think that's a good music for it. I'm not gonna play it. You can look it up. I'll keep it we still care, but I don't think that you do. I don't think that you do. I think you wanna control everything in our lives. I think that you don't really understand. God, we just want to see your own way back now, way back now, and it's just been hell since you came back in my life. Just a few times in a way that I know. And I'm falling down a path of retribution, and I hope I can do good. And I still wish I could still love right, be right. And I'm sorry for the way I've been, the way I've seen when I shouldn't, because I trust you, trust yeah. Then we're gonna go to her video, the complex transphobia of Dave Chappelle. Alright, and we'll have a conversation about that. Or not that part. I hate when I try and have it spot and then it won't. Alright.
Hello, interwebs. I hope you're doing well, because your video for me this week, because I felt the need to talk around a certain topic, a lot of discourse this week, specifically the discourse surrounding comedian Dave Chappelle and his new Netflix special, The Closer, and jokes that he made in it that many people have deemed to be transphobic.
For the special, he said he supported J.K. Rowling's stance on transgender people, and he even said that he was, quote, Team TERF. And of course, those statements are deeply charged. And
I forgot to make it big again.
Like GLAAD, a lot of discourse and discussion, not only
Let me
within
see.
the LGBTQ
Pausing it.
transgender community, but also the Black community as well.
Okay.
Hello, Interweb. Hope you're doing well, because you're getting an extra video.
Okay. I wish that YouTube would just make closed captions work automatically for me. And I'm gonna make that bigger. And I'm gonna have it like, yeah, that works. It's good. It's solid. Alright.
Hello, Interwebs. I hope you're doing well, because you're getting an extra video from me this week, because I felt the need to talk around a certain topic that's gotten a lot of discourse this week, specifically the discourse surrounding comedian Dave Chappelle and his new Netflix special, The Closer, and jokes that he made in it that many people have deemed to be transphobic. For example, within the special, he said he supported J.K. Rowling's stance on transgender people, and he even said that he was, quote, Team TERF. And of course, those statements are deeply charged, and of course caused a lot of LGBTQ rights groups like GLAAD to condemn the special. Also started generating a lot of discourse and discussion, not only within the LGBTQ and the transgender community, but also the Black community as well. TERFs also got in on the conversation. Conservatives and a whole bunch of other people all kind of started talking about this special for different reasons. And obviously the first and most obvious one is that discourse that all kind of comes up with this type of, discourse around comedians making possibly offensive jokes, that people are being too sensitive or not getting the joke, or comedians are complaining that they aren't able to make good jokes anymore. See Bill Burr or Bill Maher or Ricky Gervais for examples of that. And then there's other folks on the other side saying like, no, these comedians are being just that, being transphobic. They're being homophobic. And that is how discussion around Dave Chappelle has been framed, that it's just sort of the discourse about like, oh, people are being too sensitive, sort of that go at each sort of culture war discussion that we've had. And yet, I feel like, having watched the special, that this specific situation around Dave Chappelle actually goes a lot deeper than that discourse. And I think this discussion actually hits upon interesting specific intersections of how we talk about issues of race, transphobia, LGBTQ issues in general, and especially in the context of when we talk and criticizing someone like Dave Chappelle, a Black man. And I think that this is especially pertinent because this is something that Chappelle himself directly addressed within the entire special. I think that's kind of the whole centering of the point of the special. And so I feel like the fact that this has just been diluted to that culture war conversation has kind of missed the larger discourse that should be going on, to just dilute the whole conversation to being Dave Chappelle transphobic jokes, and we should either defend him or not defending him depending on which side of the culture war that we're on. And it goes much. Nuance is a thing. And so I want to dive deeper into this because I think there's a lot more intersections here that we need to discuss around this special and how we talk about trans issues in a nuanced way, within also intersecting discussions with the Black community and other communities and things like that. So let's get into that. But before we dive in, I do need to put a few disclaimers on this. The first thing first is I'm going to give my whole opinion on this whole discussion, including my thoughts on Dave Chappelle's jokes and his special. With this video, as with everything, is never to cancel or hate someone. I will be calling out stuff that I take issue with, and I will make my stance known, but my reasoning for doing videos like this is never to condemn a person or cancel a person. I don't find that to be particularly useful in these types of discussions. Instead, my goal, as usual, is to use a topical conversation to dive at the heart of an issue, because I think that this is just indicative of a conversation that we have. And this is a conversation that I don't claim a definitive answer on. But what I'm going to do is just give you the information about the context that it sits within so you can make up your own mind, while also at least trying to provide my own perspective on it as well, but also trying to make the distinction clear where my perspective is and where there's going on here, and trying to be understanding of both sides of the issue. While I will be critical of Chappelle, and believe me, I will be very critical of Chappelle throughout this video, this conversation it needs to be more complex than just saying Chappelle is bad, because I think he also has some really salient points in the special that have been completely removed from the large discourse that I'm going to try to at least bring back up into the conversation. Secondly, what should be quite obvious is I am a white trans woman talking about race. So while I'm going to be providing my commentary. I'm also going to try my best to include or at least point to some perspectives from some of those links down in the description below. I'll quote a few people within this video, but I also encourage you to seek out more than just the ones that I provide, because like the trans and larger LGBTQ community as a whole, the Black is a monolith with a singular opinion. So it's worthwhile the larger discussion that's been going on here, because again, I do think that this needs to be a conversation, not a dictation on one way or the other. So, with all those qualifiers out of the way, let's get into this. So, I think the best place to start is with the specific jokes that have gotten the most attention within the special. So let's take a look at what Chappelle said and break down why people found them to be particularly offensive. And again, keep in mind, I'm going to add more depth and nuance to this discussion, but I am going to start off by talking about why these specific jokes are offensive to trans folks.
Cancel J.K. My God, J.K. Rowling wrote all the Harry Potter books by herself. And they canceled her because she said in an interview, and this is not exactly what it is, gender was a fact. And then the trans community got mad as shit. They started calling her a TERF. I didn't even know what the fuck it was.
So this was the joke that got the most attention, with him defending J.K. Rowling and her words. Now, in the special, Chappelle frames what J.K. Rowling said as simply being gender is a fact, which is actually far and away from what she actually said. Now, I've done a whole video on the specifics of what J.K. Rowling said, so if you want to know the nitty-gritty of that discussion, you can check it out there. But to kind of summarize that video and J.K. Rowling's essay, what J.K. Rowling did act, but what she did do was use a ton of misinformation and fear-mongering tactics in order to try the identity of trans people, specifically transgender women. For example, Rowling cited the work of Lisa Lightman, who did this work on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is the science idea which alleges that young assigned female birth folks, people who were transgender at this like huge rate due to making transness sound like a fad that you can just get in on the trend. But what Rowling to mention when she cites Lisa Lightman's study was how that study was actually begging the question, as all the results of that study come out of a survey that was posted on sites from parents with gender dysphoria. So she was kind of really begging the question with that study, is like, oh, there's a lot of people that are worried about rapid onset gender dysphoria and seeing, because she only asked people who were seeing those symptoms and worried about rapid onset gender dysphoria. The methodology of Lightman's work has been incredibly questioned. And then also, J.K. into this fear-mongering idea of detrans, saying that there's this huge wave of girls who have harmed their bodies with surgeries trying to be trans, only to later learn that they aren't trans and have done damages to themselves with hormones and surgeries and things like that. And this can, and I've done videos on that, but the number of detransitioners within the trans community is incredibly small. There's been numerous studies that have found that very few people actually detransition, between, some studies say 8% and some studies say as small as 2% of trans. And even within those numbers, most of the people do detransition for reasons other than thinking that transition isn't right for them. Like, for example, being in an area where transition isn't safe or not having enough money to transition, things like that. With the number of people who actually detransition who believe that they have started transitioning in the first place was around 0.4% of the people that detransition. So a very small percentage of an already very small percentage. And even of that small percentage, very few of those people have done irreversible damage to their bodies, like with things like surgeries. So yes, detransitioners are an issue, and I'm not unsympathetic towards that. We definitely need to be talking about that. I have in several videos. But instead of trying to argue that we need to do better in terms of understanding trans healthcare, being more affirming, being, setting up sort of good ways to understand trans healthcare, J.K. Rowling in her essay actually argued to stop trans affirming healthcare, to stop actually trying to give more tools for trans to understand themselves, and specifically take away trans affirming care for children. And also in the essay, she constantly invalidates trans women as women and also infantilized trans men, saying that they might just be denying their right to identify as themselves. So there's a lot of problems with J.K. Rowling's essay, least of which that all of these are similar talking points and ideologies of trans exclusion TERFs. Much of what J.K. Rowling of what J.K. Rowling said were basically just the talking points of many TERF groups. It, in fact, he says is basically the outline for Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage, which is a book that is sort of one of the leading TERF, the same myths and studies and more that J.K. Rowling states, and sort of the fear-mongering about detransitioners. So J.K. Rowling did much more than just say gender is a fact, and also the fact that she's using TERF ideology is something that Dave Chappelle is aware of, brings up in the special.
So I looked it up. TERF is an acronym. Stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. This is the real thing. This is a group of women. Transgender. They don't hate transgender women, but they look at trans women the way we black offends them. Like, ooh, this bitch is doing an impression of me.
So here Dave Chappelle does a couple other interesting things. He kind of does the same thing that he did with J.K. Rowling, saying that, all they're saying is just something totally understandable and normal. Yet the one example he uses is that TERFs are saying that trans like blackface for women. So there's a few things with that. Firstly, like J.K. Rowling, I've done a whole video on TERFs and where their ideology comes from and why they're so harmful specifically to trans, also to just women's rights in general. So check out that video for that deeper dive. But let's specifically hone in on that blackface example here. What blackface was a practice done by people in vaudeville and early film, and still to this day in a lot of cases, done to explicitly mock and make fun of black people. That's the history of blackface. Blackface was there to mock black people. The whole intention of it to insult black folks. But as Dave Chappelle himself says within this special, trans women, so to compare someone's identity, the very fact that, and compare our personhood, our sense of self, to mocking of womanhood, mocking an identity, it has this implication that trans women's identities are valid but are intentionally mockeries of womanhood. Actually women, but we're just making fun of what women are. It kind of implicitly frames trans women as intentionally condescending and sexist just through our basic existence and our basic sense of self. And so to compare trans women's existence to blackface is... Now, Dave Chappelle in the special doesn't say that he is saying, but he does just state it as that's just simply the TERF ideology. Number one, kind of...
It really is just insulting to compare somebody to the term of blackface as being a mockery of... It's just trans women are women. People are their identity. I hate that correlation was made. And it's also really sad because it downplays both of the issues with that comparison being made. And to this day, people still justify blackface or like person of color face, whatever it is, and call it a joke even when people make it a mental show, even if they're whatever. But I'm just tired of people acting like, the impact of our actions don't exist, no matter if we meant to do good with it or not, you know what I mean? So, and it's really disingenuous for someone to frame things like this. I'm not sure if he looked into it, but it's really awful how many people are like high profile, well-known type folks, right? And then they just they continue to spread misinformation campaigns. Unintentionally or not, it's just not right. And someone who's sending views to millions of people across the world and influencing our societal standard or way of thinking, I just think it's something we really need to be mindful of.
And kind of normalizing it as like, oh yeah, that's an okay thing to be, and not the like actual horrible comparison that it is. And it also perpetuates this negative implication and normalizes that belief that TERFs have. This perpetuation of the negative connotation of trans people, that intentionally deceptive, harmful mocking of womanhood, is exactly what TERFs want to perpetuate in. Because while Chappelle states that TERFs just believe this one thing, that's all they're saying, that's not actually the case. For those of you who don't, actually an active dogmatic hate group that specifically targets trans people. Again, I did a whole video going into the specifics of that. To give you a little bit of a short list, for example, TERFs actively campaign with right-wing hate groups like the WLF, which is a TERF group, actually actively promotes that they do that on their site, despite the fact that the Heritage Foundation has done a lot to harm women's rights and actually has done a lot of campaigning against women's rights, like abortion access and things like that. We also see things like Vocal Parker have been platformed by alt-right groups. Many conservative newspapers and groups that are, anti-transgender, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women's rights also platform TERF ideas and people. TERFs have also actively campaigned against trans-affirming healthcare for trans youth. They've also helped promote legislation in both the UK and the US denying trans rights and trans access to healthcare, especially for kids. And similarly, TERF groups like the WLF, who I mentioned before, have also actively campaigned against the expansion of LGBTQ rights. If any of these expansions of LGBTQ rights have any affirmations online, actively harassing transgender people in online spaces like Twitter is a practice that often leads to mental health issues and suicidal ideation for transgender folks in real life. I myself have harassment from TERFs and things like that, though that point. TERFs have also participated in helped to push protests that have sometimes led to violence and trans allies, and they've also tried to incite violence against trans people in a lot of different cases. The point that I'm trying to get at, difference of opinion that you're just saying like, oh, trans people offensive to womanhood. They're an active hate group. They actively try to harm, and sort of frame them as just an ideological difference, as something like, oh yeah, it denies the very real harm caused to trans women and trans people in general. Women in general, trans or cisgender, and cisgender being basically, not that term means. Also normalizing their harmful rhetoric, it's pushing it into the mainstream, especially when Chappelle himself then goes on to say that Team TERF.
I'm Team TERF.
Also, I'd like to say with people detransitioning and stuff, honestly, you have to think about how our society pushes how they expect people to be and how they expect people to fit in a box. And sometimes people can feel a certain way, not want to go through surgery, or sometimes they do, or sometimes they just want one thing or the other, because it's up to the person how they genuinely feel about their representation and how they want to present themselves. And I think that if we didn't have this needing to put people in boxes, a lot less people would just go into it